The New Mexico desert did not offer comfort. It offered truths, hard and baked as the alkali flats that shimmered under a merciless sun. The train, a black iron centipede, crawled across this landscape, its smoke a greasy smear against an achingly blue sky. Inside, the air was a thick stew of coal dust, sweat, and the stale ghost of whiskey. It was an atmosphere of transit, of men and women caught between a place they'd left and a place they hadn't yet reached, their hopes and despairs rattling along with the carriage wheels. In a corner seat, facing backwards, sat Silas Boone. He was a man built of the same hard truths as the land outside, tall and broad. His frame seemed too large for the cramped bench, forcing him into a posture of coiled stillness. His face was a map of sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of long days staring into distances and nights spent with no roof but the stars. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a quiet emptiness, the look of a man who had seen too much and felt too little afterward. They were fixed on the blur of sand and scrub rushing away from him, as if watching his own past recede. He wore the uniform of his kind scuffed boots, worn denim, and a heavy canvas duster that had seen more weather than a church steeple. The coat was unbuttoned despite the heat, a silent testament to preparedness. Beneath it, on his hip, rested the worn wooden grip of a Colt peacemaker. It was as much a part of him as his hands, which now rested on his knees. They were large, calloused hands, scarred with a history of rope burns, branding irons, and the occasional splintered bone. They were still, but not relaxed. They were waiting. Silas was always waiting. For what? He no longer knew. His mind was a quiet, dusty place, much like the land. Memories drifted through it like tumbleweeds, the scent of rain on sagebrush, the low nicker of a good horse at dawn, the faint, ghost-like image of a woman's smile. Her name had been Mary Ann. The name was a dull ache now, a half-forgotten song. The dream they'd built had crumbled into dust, blown away by a cruel wind he could never seem to outrun. So he rode. He worked cattle. He took odd jobs. He moved on. Now, he was on this train, heading toward a town called Redemption, a name so ironic it felt like a cosmic joke. He wasn't seeking redemption. He was just seeking the next sunrise, the next paycheck, the next quiet moment to let the ghosts settle. The train groaned and hissed, slowing its pace as it approached a desolate water stop that barely qualified as a station. It was little more than a wooden tower, a dusty platform, and a sun-bleached shed. A few figures shuffled in the heat, their movements lethargic. Silas didn't turn his head. The comings and goings of others were just ripples on a pond he no longer cared to watch. But then, a new sound cut through the rhythmic clatter, a frantic scrabbling, a gasp of breath that was more a sob than an intake of air. The carriage door at the far end was thrown open, and she appeared. She was a flicker of frantic motion in a world that had been moving in a slow, grinding rhythm. Young, maybe 17 or 18, with hair the color of sun-scorched wheat, which had escaped its pins and now clung to her damp face in wild strands. Her dress, a simple calico, was torn at the shoulder and smudged with dirt along the hem, but it was her eyes that seized the attention of the few who bothered to look. They were wide, the color of a stormy sky, and filled with a terror so profound it seemed to vibrate in the thick air of the car. She looked like a doe that had just scrambled out of the path of a wolf pack, her chest heaving, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. She stumbled into the car, her gaze darting from face to face. She saw hardened prospectors who turned away, their expressions flat and uninterested. She saw a stout woman with 2 noisy children who pulled her brood closer, shielding them as if from a contagion. She saw men whose eyes lingered on her with a predatory curiosity that made a fresh wave of nausea roll through her. No help there, no sanctuary. Every face was a closed door. Her desperate eyes continued their sweep, and then they stopped. They locked onto Silas. He hadn't turned away. He hadn't leered. He had simply watched her, his expression unreadable, his stillness a stark contrast to her chaotic panic. He was like a great, weathered rock in the middle of a rushing, dangerous river. She didn't know why, but in that moment, he was the only solid thing in her entire world. With the last of her strength, she lurched down the aisle, stumbling over a misplaced satchel, her hands held out as if to ward off invisible blows. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably, their low murmurs a sign of disapproval at this disruption of their uncomfortable peace. She ignored them. She reached his seat, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She leaned down, her face close to his. He could smell the dust on her, and the sharp, metallic scent of fear. He expected a plea for money, for help, for protection. He expected a story. He got none of that. Her voice was a threadbare whisper, so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the hissing steam from the engine. "Please," she breathed, her terrified eyes locked on his. "Mister, please, hide me." Silas remained motionless, his gaze steady. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask who she was running from or why. The story was written all over her in the torn dress, the wild eyes, the way she flinched when the carriage door creaked behind her. Questions were a luxury, and she was fresh out of them. He saw the truth of her situation, and for a man like Silas, that was enough. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. His left hand, the one that had been resting on his knee, moved. He lifted the edge of his heavy duster. It was not a grand gesture, but a simple, practical one. He created a small, dark space between his body and the coarse fabric, an invitation into shadow and silence. The relief that washed over her face was so immense it was painful to watch. It was the look of a drowning person who has just found a piece of driftwood. Without another word, she sank to the floor, her movements clumsy with haste and exhaustion. She curled herself into the smallest possible ball, tucking her head down and pressing herself into the narrow space he had made. Silas let the duster fall, covering her completely. To any casual observer, it would look as if he were merely a large man with his coat draped awkwardly over his lap. He could feel the slight weight of her, the warmth of her body against his leg. He could feel the fine, uncontrollable tremors that shook her frame. Beneath the thick canvas, he heard her clamp a hand over her own mouth to stifle the sound of her own ragged breathing. He returned his hand to his knee and resumed his watch of the passing desert. His face the same impassive mask it had been before. The world rushed backwards, and the sun beat down. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The train jolted back into motion, its wheels beginning their slow, rhythmic chant. For a few blessed moments, there was only the sound of the train and the frantic, muffled breathing from beneath his coat. The girl's trembling began to subside, replaced by the deep, shuddering breaths of someone on the verge of collapse. Then the carriage door at the far end slammed open again, with a force that made people jump. 3 men stood silhouetted against the bright doorway. They were not men who belonged on a passenger train. They were cut from a rougher cloth, their faces hard, their clothes stained with the grime of hard riding. The one in the lead was a portly man with a greasy vest stretched tight over a substantial belly. A silver watch chain was looped across it, a small point of vanity in an otherwise slovenly appearance. His face was florid, with small, piggish eyes that scanned the car with an air of arrogant ownership. His name was Jebediah Kane, and he was the kind of man who bought and sold things: land, cattle, and sometimes people. Flanking him were 2 others. One was a tall, gaunt man with a long, drooping mustache and eyes so pale they seemed empty. The other was shorter, built like a bulldog, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they could crush stone. They carried themselves with the lazy confidence of hired muscle, their hands never straying far from the pistols holstered at their hips. "We're looking for someone," Jebediah announced, his voice a gravelly boom that filled the sudden silence of the car. "A girl, young, blonde hair, Got herself on this train back at the last stop. She belongs to me?" He said the words, "belongs to me," with a finality that made the stout woman pull her children even closer. No one spoke. No one met his gaze. The unspoken code of the West was thick in the air. Don't see anything. Don't hear anything. Don't get involved. Trouble was a disease, and no one wanted to catch it. Beneath Silas's coat, the girl went rigid. The tremors returned, violent and sharp. Silas could feel the frantic hammering of her heart against his leg. He didn't move a muscle. His gaze remained fixed on the desert outside, his posture one of supreme indifference. The two thugs began to move down the aisle, peering under seats, their movements slow and deliberate. Jebediah followed, his small eyes missing nothing. He stopped by the stout woman, leaning in close. "You see a girl like that, ma'am, running scared?" The woman shook her head, her face pale, unable to form words. Jebediah grunted and moved on. They worked their way down the car, a wave of palpable menace moving before them. Silas could hear them getting closer, the heavy thud of their boots on the wooden floorboards. He felt the girl Ellie. He'd decided to call her in his mind, for she needed a name, trying to shrink herself even smaller, to melt into the floor. Finally, they reached his seat. The two thugs stopped, looking down at the large, unmoving man. Their gazes passed over him, lingered for a second on the draped coat, and then moved on. He was just a big cowboy, minding his own business, but Jebediah was more perceptive. "Well now," the portly man said, his voice slick with false cordiality. "What have we here?" Silas slowly turned his head, his pale blue eyes lifting to meet Jebediah's. He said nothing. His silence was a wall. Jebediah's eyes narrowed. He looked at Silas's size, at the calm way he held himself, at the worn butt of the pistol visible just inside his coat. He was no fool. This was not a man to be trifled with lightly, but he was also a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "You're a big fella," Jebediah observed, tapping a fat finger on the back of the seat. "Taking up a lot of room. You seen a little gal, about so high, looking like a spooked rabbit." Silas held his gaze for a long moment. The train rattled on. The tension in the small space was so thick he could taste it, a mix of coal smoke and fear. Beneath his coat, the girl held her breath. Finally, Silas spoke. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "No." It was a single word, flat and final. It offered no room for argument, no invitation for further conversation. Jebediah's eyes flickered down to the duster covering Silas's lap. A flicker of suspicion. A man didn't wear a coat like that in this heat unless he had a reason. "You sure about that?" he pressed, a sneer touching his lips. "Maybe you got something under that big coat of yours you don't want us to see." The bulldog-like man took a half-step forward, his hand dropping to his pistol. Silas didn't even glance at him. His focus remained entirely on Jebediah. He didn't move his hands from his knees, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening of the muscles in his shoulders that was more threatening than any drawn weapon. The emptiness in his eyes was replaced by something else, something cold and hard and ancient. It was a look that said he had crossed lines other men wouldn't even approach, and he would not hesitate to cross them again. "I'm sure," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying a quiet warning that vibrated through the floor. Jebediah stared into those pale eyes and saw his own reflection. He saw a man who had nothing to lose and was not afraid of violence. Starting a gunfight in a crowded, moving train car over a suspicion was a bad bet. There would be other ways, other times. He held the stare for another second, then forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "All right, friend. No need to get touchy." He waved a dismissive hand at his men. "She ain't here. Let's check the next car." He turned and swaggered away, his thugs falling in behind him. The carriage door slammed shut, plunging the car back into its previous state of weary silence. The collective breath that had been held was released in a quiet sigh. Slowly, the tension began to leak out of the air, Beneath the heavy canvas coat, the small, trembling form finally went limp, the last of her terrified strength giving way to utter, bone-deep exhaustion. Silas Boone kept his gaze on the window, watching the endless, unforgiving desert rush by. He hadn't invited this trouble, but it had found him, and now, curled up at his feet, was a piece of it he couldn't just walk away from. The echoes of the confrontation faded, but the threat remained, a toxic residue in the stale air of the train car. Silas knew men like Jebediah Kane. They were vultures, patient and persistent. They wouldn't give up easily. Leaving the train at the next scheduled stop was not an option. It would be an invitation to a confrontation he couldn't guarantee winning, not with the girl in tow. They would be watching, waiting for her to reappear. He remained still for several long minutes, letting the rhythm of the train lull the other passengers back into their weary stupor. Beneath his coat, the girl, Ellie, was a bundle of spent fear. Her tremors had ceased, replaced by a profound stillness that was almost as worrying. He shifted his legs slightly, a subtle movement, and felt her flinch. She was a tightly wound spring, ready to snap at the slightest touch. His gaze returned to the window, but he was no longer seeing the landscape. He was reading it, his eyes, accustomed to spotting a stray calf from a mile away, scanned the terrain for opportunity. He noted the gentle slope of the embankments, the patches of thick scrub brush, the way the tracks began to curve around a low, rocky mesa. That was it, the curve. The train would have to slow, even if only slightly. And the curve would offer a brief moment of concealment from any eyes watching from the forward cars. He had made his decision. The time for sitting still was over. He slowly lifted the edge of his duster. Ellie blinked in the sudden dim light, her eyes wide and unfocused. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of terror and utter confusion. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. It wasn't in his nature. Instead, he met her gaze directly, and his eyes, clear and steady, conveyed the entire message. "We are leaving, now. Trust me." He rose to his full height in one fluid motion, his large frame momentarily blocking the aisle. He extended a hand down to her. It was not a gentle offering, but a firm, commanding gesture. For a split second, she hesitated, the instinct to flee from this new, unknown danger warring with the memory of the three men. She looked from his calloused hand to his unreadable face, and chose the devil she didn't know. Her small, trembling hand slipped into his. His grip was strong and sure, enveloping hers completely. He pulled her to her feet. She swayed, her legs unsteady, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Quiet," he murmured, the word a low rumble in his chest. He led her toward the rear of the car. Heads turned. Curious eyes watched them for a moment, and then quickly looked away. A man and a girl, both looking like they'd been dragged through a briar patch. Moving with grim purpose, it was the kind of scene that wise people made a point to forget immediately. They reached the platform connecting the cars. The world outside the quiet carriage was a violent, roaring chaos. The wind whipped at them, tearing at their clothes and filling the air with a deafening clatter of steel on steel. The ground was a dizzying, speeding blur below the narrow, swaying gangway. Ellie shrank back, her hand flying to her mouth as a wave of vertigo washed over her. The sheer, terrifying reality of what he intended to do crashed down on her. Silas didn't give her time to panic. He pulled her flush against the carriage wall, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his body. He pointed down at the blur of sand and rock. Then he looked at her, his expression intense, and held up 3 fingers. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He lowered 1 finger. 2. Her mind finally grasped his meaning. This was a countdown. A raw, primal scream built in her throat, but it was swallowed by the roar of the train. Her eyes widened in a horrified protest. This was madness. It was suicide. He lowered another finger. 1. His arm snaked around her waist. pulling her tight against his side. His grip was like iron. He was not asking for her cooperation. He was commanding her survival. He leaned out, timing the rhythm of the train's sway, his boots planted firmly on the bucking steel plate. "Now," he said, the word lost to the wind but felt as a vibration against her ear. And then they were falling. There was a moment of weightless suspension, a terrifying void where the roaring of the train was replaced by the rushing of wind in her ears. Then came the impact. It wasn't a clean landing. It was a violent, brutal collision with the earth. They hit the sandy embankment at an angle and tumbled, a chaotic mess of limbs and flying canvas. The world became a painful, scraping blur. She felt the sharp bite of gravel against her cheek, the tearing of her dress, the jarring slam of her shoulder against the hard-packed dirt. Her head cracked against something his leg. Maybe, and for a second, her vision exploded in a flash of white. They rolled and slid, the force of their momentum carrying them down the slope until they came to a jarring halt in a shallow ditch at the bottom, hidden from the tracks by a thicket of creosote. For a long moment, there was only silence. The roar of the train was already fading, a distant, rhythmic thunder. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the scrub and the harsh, ragged sound of their own breathing. Dust settled around them like a shroud. Ellie lay on her back, stunned, every inch of her body screaming in protest. The sky above was a vast, indifferent blue. Before she could fully process what had happened, Silas was moving. He pushed himself up onto one knee, his movements stiff but efficient. A long, bloody scratch ran from his temple down his cheekbone, a detail he seemed entirely unaware of. He looked at her, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Can you stand?" he asked. His voice was raw. She tried to push herself up, but a sharp, searing pain shot up from her ankle, and she cried out, collapsing back into the dust. I think it's twisted." He was at her side instantly, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he ran them over her boot. He probed the ankle, his touch firm and knowledgeable. "Not broken," he determined, "but you can't put your weight on it." Without another word, he knelt, turned his back to her, and grunted. "Get on!" She stared at his broad back, dumbfounded. "What?" "We have to move, now," he said, his voice hard with urgency. "They'll have seen the dust. They'll stop the train. Get on!" There was no arguing with the command in his voice. Wincing, she dragged herself forward, looping her arms around his thick neck as he straightened, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. Her battered body protested, but the alternative being found by Jebediah Kane in the middle of this wasteland was infinitely worse. He started to run. It wasn't a sprint, but a steady, ground-eating trot. He moved with the grim endurance of a man who knew how to pace himself against an unforgiving landscape. Ellie clung to him, her head bouncing against his shoulder, her world reduced to the rhythmic pounding of his boots on the hard earth and the steady, powerful movement of the muscles in his back. The sun was a hammer, beating down on them with a physical force. The air was dry and hot, searing their lungs with every breath. The landscape was a hostile panorama of cracked earth, skeletal bushes, and jagged rocks that shimmered in the heat. There was no shade, no water, no sign of life beyond the lizards that skittered out of their path. This was a land that didn't care if you lived or died. Silas didn't head for the open plains. He angled toward a series of low, broken hills, a chaotic jumble of red rock and deep shadow. It was harder terrain, but it offered cover. As they ran, he periodically glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the long, empty line of the tracks. He was right. In the distance, a dark shape had detached itself from the train. A plume of steam indicated it had stopped. It wouldn't be long now. They reached the edge of a wide, dry wash, a sandy riverbed that snaked through the flats. It offered a sunken path, but it was also a trap if they were caught in it. "Hold on," he grunted. He plunged into the wash and found a small, dense cluster of greasewood bushes, their leaves oily and thick. He gently set Ellie down, propping her against the sandy bank. "Don't move," he ordered. From a small leather pouch on his belt, he produced a flint and steel and a tiny ball of charcloth. He knelt, shielded his hands from the wind, and struck the flint. A tiny spark caught, glowing like a firefly. He carefully nurtured it, adding dry twigs and leaves from the base of the bush. Within a minute, a thin curl of smoke rose, then another. The oily leaves of the greasewood caught, and suddenly a thick, acrid, black smoke billowed upwards. It wasn't a large fire, but it produced a surprising amount of dense smoke, which the wind immediately began to push across the landscape, creating a hazy, shifting screen between them and the train tracks. Let's go." He scooped her up again before she could protest and used the cover of the smoke to scramble up the far side of the wash and into the foothills. For the next hour, they moved through a maze of rocks and canyons. The world was a furnace. Silas's breathing became harsher, a testament to the brutal effort of carrying a person through such terrain. Sweat soaked his shirt, and the blood from the cut on his face had dried into a dark crust. Yet he never slowed, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the terrain, choosing the path that offered the most cover. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a deep recess in a rock wall, an overhang that created a pocket of deep, cool shadow. He ducked inside and slid Ellie gently to the ground. He stood for a moment in the entrance, his body a dark silhouette against the blinding light, watching their back trail. Satisfied they weren't immediately followed, he finally allowed himself to slump against the rock wall, his chest heaving. The immediate danger was over. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by their own labored breathing. The adrenaline that had fueled them began to drain away, leaving a painful, trembling exhaustion in its wake. Ellie looked at her rescuer. His face, streaked with dust and dried blood, was grim. His clothes were torn, his knuckles were raw. He had thrown himself from a moving train and carried her for miles across a blistering desert, all for a girl whose name he didn't even know. The sheer unreality of it all washed over her. The fear, the fall, the desperate flight, it coalesced into a single, overwhelming wave of emotion. A sob escaped her, then another. She buried her face in her hands, and for the first time since she'd fled her home, she wept. They were not tears of terror, but of utter, soul-crushing exhaustion and a profound, aching confusion. Silas watched her, his expression unchanged. He didn't offer words of comfort. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He simply waited for the storm to pass. When her sobs began to subside into shuddering breaths, he pushed himself off the wall. He unhooked the canteen from his belt, uncorked it, and held it out to her. She looked up, her face tear-stained and dirty, and took it with a shaking hand. The water was warm, but it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. She drank sparingly, then handed it back. He took a short swallow himself and then walked to the mouth of their shallow cave. Resuming his watch, he stood there, a silent, immovable guardian, his gaze fixed on the hostile beauty of the desert. Ellie watched him, her mind reeling. Why would any man do this? He had gained nothing. He had risked everything. She knew nothing about him, except that his hands were scarred and his silence was as vast as the sky. Yet, as she sat there in the cool shadow, battered and bruised and impossibly far from anything she had ever known, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Under the watchful, silent protection of this dangerous stranger, she felt the first fragile flicker of safety. They walked into the twilight, a pair of battered figures moving through a landscape that was slowly softening its edges. The brutal, sun-bleached flats gave way to rolling hills dotted with the dark, hardy shapes of juniper and pinon pine. The air grew cooler, carrying the clean, sharp scent of sage. For hours, Silas had carried her, his steps never faltering. When the terrain flattened, he had set her down. allowing her to limp alongside him, his arm a steady support around her waist whenever her ankle threatened to give way. He did not speak. He conserved his energy for the journey, his focus entirely on the path ahead, reading the stars that began to prick the deep indigo sky. Ellie, for her part, was too exhausted for words. Her world had shrunk to the simple, agonizing task of putting one foot in front of the other, of matching her rhythm to the silent, implacable man beside her. The terror of the chase had receded, burned away by the sun and the endless walking, leaving behind a strange, hollowed-out peace. She was moving toward an unknown destination, guided by a man she did not know, and yet, for the first time in days, she was not running from something. She was simply walking toward it. It was well after moonrise when Silas finally stopped. They stood on the crest of a low ridge, looking down into a small, sheltered valley. And there it was. It wasn't much, just a dark, solid shape against the silvered land. But it was the most beautiful thing Ellie had ever seen. A small cabin, built of thick, rough-hewn logs, with a low-pitched roof and a single stone chimney breathing a faint, ghostly wisp of smoke into the night air. Beside it stood a lean-to stable and a fenced corral. A lone, gnarled cottonwood tree, ancient and enduring, stood guard over a well. A soft yellow light, warm and inviting, glowed in a single window. It was a small, stubborn pocket of life carved out of the vast, indifferent wilderness, a home. As they made their slow way down the slope, the cabin door opened, spilling a rectangle of light onto the dusty ground. A small figure appeared in the doorway. No taller than the latch, he stood there, perfectly still, watching their approach. When they drew closer, Ellie could see it was a boy, perhaps 6 years old, with a shock of dark hair and large, serious eyes. He wore a simple homespun shirt and trousers that were a little too short, revealing dusty, bare feet. He wasn't afraid, just watchful, his small frame exuding a quiet self-possession that was a miniature echo of the man who now stopped before him. "Tom," Silas said. It was not a greeting, but a simple statement of fact. The boy, Tom, gave a small nod in return. His solemn gaze shifted from Silas to Ellie, taking in her torn dress, her dirt-streaked face, and the way she leaned heavily on the big man beside her. His expression was one of pure, unfiltered curiosity, the way a child might examine a strange new beetle. There was no judgment in his eyes, only wonder. Silas guided Ellie toward the steps. "She's hurt her ankle," he said to the boy, by way of explanation. "Needs to rest." Tom stepped aside without a word, holding the heavy wooden door open for them. Ellie limped inside, her senses immediately filled with the simple, comforting smells of wood smoke, coffee, and drying herbs. The cabin was one large room, spare but immaculately clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a small fire crackling merrily within it. A sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. Against the far wall were 2 built-in bunks, each with a neatly folded blanket. A few iron pots hung by the hearth, and shelves holding tins and sacks of flour lined the wall near a dry sink. It was a place of simple survival, but there was an order to it, a sense of deliberate care that spoke volumes about the man who lived here. Silas led her to the table and eased her into a chair. "Stay," he commanded softly, then turned to the boy. "Water, Tom." Tom nodded and scurried to a bucket by the door, ladling water into a basin with a practiced efficiency that belied his age. He brought it to the table. Silas knelt before Ellie, gently taking her foot and removing the dusty, worn-out boot. Her ankle was swollen and bruised, a painful-looking contrast to the pale skin of her foot. He dipped a clean rag into the basin and began to clean the scrapes and cuts with methodical, impersonal movements. His touch was not gentle, but it was careful. The practical ministration of a man used to tending injuries, both animal and human. Ellie flinched, but she did not pull away. When he was finished, He tore a strip from a clean flour sack and bound her ankle tightly. His large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. He then rose and moved to the fireplace, adding a log to the embers. He looked from the pot of what smelled like beans simmering on the hearth to Ellie, then to the empty bunk. "You'll take that one," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the lower bunk. "Tom and I will take the floor." Ellie opened her mouth to protest, to say that she couldn't possibly take his bed, but the look on his face stopped her. It was not a suggestion. The matter was settled. She was a guest, and an injured one at that. In his silent, unyielding code, this was simply how things were done, overwhelmed and aching in every bone. She could only nod in gratitude. Tom brought her a plate of beans and a thick slice of cornbread, placing it on the table before her without a word. The three of them ate in a quiet that was a world away from the tense, fearful silence of the train. This was a comfortable quiet, the shared peace of a long day ending. It was the quiet of a home. After she had eaten, Silas simply pointed to the bunk again. She hobbled over, pulled a rough but clean blanket over herself, and was asleep before her head even settled on the straw-stuffed mattress. Her last conscious thought was that for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was not afraid of who might find her in the morning. She woke to the soft, gray light of dawn filtering through the single window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the past 2 days rushed back, and she sat up with a jolt. The cabin was empty. The fire had been banked, and the bedrolls where Silas and Tom had slept were gone. A profound, aching silence filled the room, broken only by the distant cawing of a crow. A familiar flicker of uncertainty pricked at her. What now? What was she supposed to do? She was a stranger here, a piece of trouble that had washed up on this man's shore. Was she a guest, a prisoner, a burden? Her ankle throbbed a dull protest as she swung her legs over the side of the bunk. She stood, testing it. It was sore, but the swelling had gone down. She could walk on it, albeit with a significant limp. She looked around the tidy cabin. On the table, a cup and a piece of leftover cornbread had been left for her. A small, unspoken act of consideration that touched her more than any words could have. She ate the bread and drank the cool water from the bucket, her mind racing. She could not simply sit here. She could not be useless. After everything this man had done for her, the thought of being another mouth to feed without contributing was unbearable. She had to find a way to earn her keep, to be something other than a problem. Driven by this new resolve, she limped to the door and pushed it open. The morning air was crisp and clean, and the rising sun painted the eastern hills in hues of soft pink and gold. The ranch, which had been a dark shape in the moonlight, was now revealed in the forgiving morning light. It was small, even more so than she had realized. The stable was little more than a shed. The corral held 2 sturdy-looking horses, and a small, fenced-in garden showed the promise of corn and squash. It was a place built on work, hard and unceasing. She saw them then. Silas was in the corral, methodically replacing a rail on the fence, his movements economical and precise. Tom was near the coop, scattering a handful of grain for a small flock of scruffy-looking chickens, his small face set in a look of intense concentration. They were absorbed in the rhythm of their morning chores, a silent, 2-person machine that kept this small world running. They both saw her. Silas paused with his hammer in midair and gave her a brief nod before turning back to his work. Tom glanced at her, then returned his attention to the chickens. No one spoke to her. No one told her what to do. And in that moment, Ellie understood. She was free to choose. She looked around, her eyes searching for a task, any task. Leaning against the cabin wall was a worn but sturdy broom made of bound twigs. She picked it up. The wooden handle felt solid and real in her hands. She started with the porch, sweeping away the dust and a few stray leaves that had blown in during the night. The simple, repetitive motion was calming, grounding. It was a task she understood. From the porch, she moved to the yard. her broom creating neat, swirling patterns in the dust. When she was done, the area around the cabin looked tidier, more cared for. It was a small change, but it was hers. Her confidence growing. She spotted the empty egg basket sitting by the coop. She limped over. The hens clucked and scattered at her approach, wary of the newcomer. She moved slowly, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice, the way she had done with the chickens back home. She found the nesting boxes and carefully collected the warm, brown eggs. Tom, finished with his own task, stood by the fence and watched her. When she turned to leave, he pointed a small, dusty finger toward the base of the cottonwood tree. Puzzled, Ellie walked over and found another small nest tucked into the roots, holding 3 more eggs. She looked back at Tom and gave him a small, hesitant smile. He did not smile back, but he gave another one of his solemn little nods before running off to his next chore. It was the first real connection she had made, a silent conspiracy of shared work. Back in the cabin, she set about preparing a midday meal. She found flour, salt, and lard, and began to make biscuits. She put the beans back on the fire to heat and sliced some salt pork to fry. She worked with a quiet, focused energy, the familiar motions of the kitchen a balm to her frayed nerves. She was not just a terrified girl running for her life anymore. She was a person who could knead dough. Who knew how much salt to add? Who could create a meal from humble ingredients? When Silas and Tom came in from their morning's work, the cabin was filled with the warm, comforting smell of baking bread and frying pork. They stopped in the doorway, their expressions unreadable. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. Had she overstepped? Had she presumed too much? Silas looked from the table, now set with 3 plates, to Ellie, who stood nervously by the hearth, wiping her hands on a rag. He sniffed the air, his gaze taking in the neat stack of fresh biscuits. Then, he simply walked to the basin, washed his hands, and sat down at the table. Tom followed his example, scrambling onto his chair. They ate. No one praised her cooking, no one thanked her for her work. But as she sat there, watching this silent man and this solemn boy eat the food she had made, a profound sense of peace settled over her. They did not need to speak. Their acceptance was in their actions. She had offered work, and they had accepted it. She had made a meal, and they were eating it. In the unspoken language of this quiet, lonely place, a contract had been formed. She was no longer just a refugee. She was a part of the rhythm of the ranch. That afternoon, as she sat on the porch mending a tear in Tom's shirt, she watched the vast, open sky and felt the gentle breeze on her face. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer all-consuming. Here, in this simple place of silent men and hard work, a tiny, fragile seed of hope had been planted, timidly, cautiously. She was beginning a new life. The days settled into a rhythm, as steady and predictable as the sun's journey across the vast New Mexico sky. Life on the ranch was a silent dance, a series of interlocking chores and movements dictated by the needs of the land and the animals. There was no clock on the wall. Time was measured in the shifting length of shadows, the lowing of the horses for their evening feed, and the gradual cooling of the air as twilight bled across the desert. Silas was the anchor of this world, a man in constant, deliberate motion. His morning started before dawn, the quiet scrape of his boots on the cabin floor, the first sound of the new day. He moved with a purpose that was ingrained in his very being, mending the things that the harsh land sought to undo. He restrung sagging barbed wire, his gloved hands twisting the metal with practiced ease. He reshod his own horse, the sharp clang of his hammer on the anvil a rhythmic heartbeat in the morning stillness. He chopped wood, his axe rising and falling in a powerful, hypnotic arc, building a bulwark against the cold nights to come. His work was solitary, a silent conversation between him and the demanding earth. Ellie, in turn, claimed the domestic sphere as her own. As her ankle healed, her limp lessening each day, her domain expanded, The cabin became her sanctuary and her responsibility. She learned the quirks of the wood-burning stove, how to bank the coals just right to keep bread from burning. She discovered that Silas, despite his hard exterior, had a fondness for the strong, bitter coffee she brewed each morning. She mended their clothes with tiny, neat stitches, her needle a small silver fish darting through coarse denim and homespun cotton. The small garden became her project, and she waged a gentle war against weeds and rabbits, coaxing green life from the dry soil with a patience she didn't know she possessed. And between them moved Tom. He was the shuttle on the loom, weaving their two separate worlds together. He would follow Silas to the corral, his small hands struggling to carry a single piece of wood, his face a mask of serious intent. Then he would race back to the cabin to report his progress to Ellie, narrating the morning's events in the breathless, disjointed way of a 6-year-old. He was the only source of chatter in their quiet lives, a cheerful, babbling brook running between two silent mountains. He belonged to both of them, and to neither, his simple presence forming a bridge across the chasm of their unspoken thoughts. It was Ellie who spoke first in their silent language. Her gestures were tentative, shy offerings left like wildflowers on an altar. One morning, while drawing water from the well, she noticed a single stalk of Indian paintbrush growing defiantly from a crack in the dry earth, its fiery red a startling splash of color against the dun landscape. She picked it carefully and brought it inside. She didn't put it on the table. That felt too bold, too much like a declaration. Instead, she found an old, empty tin can, filled it with water, and placed the solitary flower next to the wash basin where Silas scrubbed the grime from his hands at the end of each day. That evening, he came in, his face and arms streaked with dust. He stopped at the basin as always, and then he froze. His gaze fell upon the splash of red. It was a thing of fragile beauty, utterly out of place in his stark, functional world. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, which felt like an eternity to Ellie as she watched, pretending to be busy by the hearth. He did not touch the flower. He did not mention it, but she saw the slight softening of his shoulders, the way his gaze lingered on it before he finally began to wash. The gesture had been received. The silence had been understood. A few days later, she grew bolder. Silas had a habit after the evening meal. He would take a cup of coffee and go sit on a large, flat-topped boulder near the corral that overlooked the valley. It was his thinking place, his throne of solitude. Ellie watched him go there night after night, his large frame settling onto the hard, cold stone. The next afternoon, while he was out checking the southern fence line, she took an old, clean grain sack. She spent an hour filling it with the softest, driest grasses she could find, along with scraps of cloth left over from her mending. The result was a lumpy, humble cushion, but it was soft. Just before dusk, she walked out and placed it on the center of the boulder. When Silas emerged from the cabin that evening, coffee cup in hand, he walked toward his rock as usual. He stopped when he saw the cushion. He nudged it with the toe of his boot, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She expected him to kick it aside, to reject this intrusion of softness into his hard-edged routine. For a long moment, he just looked at it. Then, he deliberately sat down, right on top of it. He settled his weight, shifted slightly as if to test its comfort, and took a sip of his coffee as he stared out at the sunset. From the cabin doorway, Ellie felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. He had accepted her comfort. He had allowed her to care for him, in this small, unspoken way. Silas's responses, when they came, were as silent and as practical as he was. He was not a man who dealt in flowers or soft things. His language was one of wood, iron, and water. Ellie had found a favorite spot on the porch, a place where the morning sun was warm, but not yet hot, where she could sit and do her mending. One of the floorboards beneath her rocking chair was loose, and it issued a loud, groaning creak every time she shifted her weight. It was a minor annoyance, one she had simply gotten used to. One afternoon, she went inside to fetch more thread. When she came back out, Silas was there. He had his hammer and a handful of nails, and he was kneeling on the porch, securing the loose board. He worked quickly and efficiently, his blows precise and powerful. He didn't look up at her or acknowledge her presence. When he was finished, he gathered his tools and walked away toward the stable. Ellie went back to her chair and sat down. She rocked back and forth. The porch was solid. The porch was silent. He had noticed her small discomfort, and he had fixed it. The heat of the afternoon was always the most draining part of the day, especially when she worked in the garden, hunched over the rows of fledgling plants. The water in the cabin's bucket would grow warm and unappealing. One brutally hot afternoon, as she was about to give up and retreat inside, she saw him walking back from the stable. He stopped at the well, which was in the full, punishing glare of the sun. He drew a bucket, the rope creaking in protest, but instead of drinking from it himself, he carried the heavy, sloshing bucket over to the shade of the cottonwood tree, right by the path that led to the garden. He set it down and walked into the cabin. A few minutes later, Ellie walked past the tree on her way inside. The water in the bucket was fresh, deep, and blessedly cold. He had anticipated her thirst and had gone out of his way to offer her a cool drink. It was a cup of cold water given in the desert, a gesture of profound and quiet kindness. His most powerful statement, however, came each night. The first week she was there, Ellie had slept fitfully, her ears straining at every night sound, the memory of pursuit still a fresh wound. She never felt truly safe, even behind the cabin's solid wooden door. Then, one evening, she noticed Silas's new ritual. After their meal, after he had taken his coffee on his cushioned rock, he would come back inside. He would walk to the door, and after ensuring the simple wooden latch was in place, he would reach for something she hadn't noticed before, a heavy iron bar that rested on two hooks beside the frame. With a quiet grunt of effort, he would lift the bar and slide it into two thick iron brackets on the door and the frame. The sound of the heavy bar settling into place was a deep, resonant thud that echoed in the small cabin. It was the sound of a fortress being sealed. It was the sound of absolute safety. He never said, "You are safe here." He never said, "I will protect you." He didn't have to. Every night, the sound of that iron bar spoke for him, a solemn, nightly vow that no harm would enter that door while he was there. Tom, oblivious to the delicate, unspoken conversation unfolding around him, served as its unwitting translator. He was the one who gave their gestures a voice. He would carry one of Ellie's freshly baked biscuits out to the stable. "Ellie made this for you," he would announce to Silas, turning her anonymous act of cooking into a personal gift. He would find a colorful, smooth stone on one of his wanderings with Silas and bring it back to the cabin, placing it in Ellie's sewing basket. Silas saw it. He'd say proudly, "He said the color was like your dress." He forced them into a shared world. He would grab Ellie's hand with one of his and Silas's with the other, pulling them both toward the corral to look at a lizard he had cornered. In that moment, they were not a man and a woman from two different worlds, but two adults being led by an excited child, their hands brushing, their shared focus on the small, fleeting wonder before them. Through Tom's innocent chatter, Ellie learned that Silas's horse was named Dust Devil and that he'd had him since he was a colt. Through Tom, Silas learned that Ellie sometimes hummed a sad, sweet song when she was kneading dough. And so, their days passed, filled with a language that had no words. It was a conversation held in a repaired porch, a cushioned stone, a cup of cool water, and a flower in a tin can. As Ellie sat on the porch one evening, watching the sky melt into a blaze of orange and purple, she looked over at Silas on his rock and Tom drawing circles in the dust at his feet. A profound sense of calm washed over her. She was no longer the terrified girl who had stumbled onto the train. She was not a burden. She was not a victim. She was a woman who knew how to make a home, and a man who knew how to protect it. And in the vast, lonely silence of the high desert, they were slowly, carefully, building one together. The kitchen was the last bastion of warmth as the cool desert night pressed against the cabin walls. The fire in the hearth had been banked, its glow a soft, pulsing orange that painted the log walls in shifting shadows. Tom, worn out by a day of relentless discovery, was a small, still mound under a blanket in his bunk, his soft breathing a gentle counterpoint to the quiet crackle of the embers. The evening meal was over. The simple, hearty fare a comfort in their bellies. All that remained was the cleaning, the final chore that closed the door on the day. It had become their ritual. After Tom was asleep, Ellie would heat water while Silas brought the plates to the dry sink. Usually, he would then retreat to his rock or his mending, leaving her to the solitude of her work. But tonight was different. Tonight, after setting the last tin plate on the edge of the sink, he did not leave. Instead, he picked up a clean, dry flour sack and leaned against the counter beside her, his large frame casting a long, protective shadow over her. Ellie worked, her hands moving with a familiar grace in the warm, soapy water, the clink of a fork against a plate, the soft splash of the water. These were the only sounds in the cabin. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It never was. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding. But tonight, it felt different. It felt heavier, filled with the things she had never said, the questions he had never asked, the safety he had built around her, brick by silent brick, had become so solid that she felt the foundations of her own carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. The need to speak, to unburden the poison she had carried for so long, was becoming a physical ache in her chest. She washed the last plate and set it in the rinse basin. Her hands were submerged in the warm water, but she felt a sudden chill, a tremor that had nothing to do with the night air. "I never said thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The words seemed small and inadequate in the vast quiet. Silas shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking softly. "Nothing to thank for." "No," she insisted, still not looking at him, her gaze fixed on her hands in the water. "You don't understand. You saved my life." He was silent for a moment. Then he took the plate she had just washed and began to dry it, his movements slow and deliberate. Anyone would have done the same. A small, bitter laugh escaped her. "No," she said, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "They wouldn't. Most people, they look the other way. They don't want to get involved in other folks' trouble." She finally turned her head, looking at his profile in the dim firelight. "You walked right into mine. You didn't even ask what it was." He finished drying the plate, his gaze on his work. "Saw the trouble. Didn't need the story." "But you deserve it," she said, the words tumbling out now as if a dam had broken. "You deserve to know what kind of rattler you picked up out of the dust." She turned back to the sink, her hands moving automatically, washing the same fork over and over. Her story began not with a shout, but with a sigh of resignation, the sound of a long-held breath finally being released. "My pa, he's not a strong man," she began, her voice soft and laced with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. "The land was hard on him. The drought last year, it broke him, took the last of his fight right out of him. We owed money, a lot of it." She paused, taking a shaky breath. Silas continued to dry the silverware, each piece making a soft, metallic clink as he laid it on the table. It was a steadying sound, a small anchor in the turbulent sea of her memory. "The man we owed, his name is Jebediah Kane," she said, and the name was like a foul taste in her mouth. "He owns the big saloon in Redemption, the one with the painted ladies on the sign. He owns a lot of things. He lends money to farmers when they're desperate, and then he takes their land when they can't pay. He's a patient spider, my pa used to say." She could see him so clearly in her mind's eye, his florid face, His small, acquisitive eyes that seemed to miss nothing and value nothing. The stale scent of cigars and whiskey that clung to him like a second skin. "He started coming round our place," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "At first, he was polite, called my pa, sir, brought sweets from town. But the way he looked at me, I felt like I needed to scrub my skin raw after he left. He wasn't looking at a person. He was looking at a horse he was thinking of buying, checking its teeth and its legs." Silas stopped drying. He stood perfectly still beside her, the cloth held in his hand. He was listening with his entire being. "One day, Pa told me Cain had made him an offer, a way to clear all the debt, a way for us to keep the farm. He called it a marriage proposal. He said Cain had taken a shine to me, that he wanted to make me his wife." Her hand stilled in the water. "But it wasn't a proposal. It was a transaction. He wasn't asking for my hand. He was closing a deal. My pa, he sold me, Silas. He sold me for a few acres of dust and freedom from a debt he couldn't face." The confession hung in the air, stark and ugly. She had never said the words aloud before, and they felt like stones in her mouth. She expected him to say something, to react with shock or pity, but he did nothing. He simply stood there, a silent, solid presence in the dim light. His silence was a gift. It did not judge. It did not question. It simply allowed her story to exist. After a long moment, he picked up another fork and resumed drying it. The simple, domestic sound was all the encouragement she needed. "I told my pa I wouldn't do it. I screamed. I cried. I begged. But it was like talking to a ghost. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He just kept saying it was for the best, that I'd have a fine life, that I'd never want for anything. He didn't understand that I didn't want things. I just wanted to be my own. The day before I was supposed to be handed over, I found a small carpet bag on my bed. My pa had packed it for me. My mother's locket, a spare dress, a brush. It was my whole life, packed up to be taken away. And that's when I knew I couldn't stay. I would rather die in the desert than live in that man's house." She remembered the terror of that night, the way she had crept from her own home like a thief, the sound of her own heartbeat a deafening drum in her ears. "So I ran. I took the bag and I ran. I thought if I could just get to the train, I could disappear, go somewhere he'd never find me." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "But it wasn't just me he was after, Silas. It was the bag." He finally turned his head, his pale eyes meeting hers. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "It wasn't mine," she whispered. "When Pa packed it, he put something in the bottom, under the dress. I think he did it without even thinking, like he was just gathering up my things. Or maybe some small part of him wanted me to have a weapon. It was my mother's old sewing box, and inside it was a small, leather-bound ledger." She took a deep breath. Cain used to do business with my pa, before the big debts. And my pa, he kept records of everything. This ledger, it has all of Cain's dealings in it. The names of men he cheated, the illegal rates he charged, the land he took by forging signatures. It's all in there. It's proof that could ruin him. That's what they were after on the train. They weren't just chasing a runaway girl. They were chasing their own downfall. The whole sordid story was finally out, lying between them in the quiet kitchen. The weight that had been pressing down on her for weeks, for months, finally began to lift. She had been carrying this burden alone for so long, and now it was shared. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear slid down her cheek and dropped into the dishwater with a tiny, silent splash. Then another followed. They were not the wild, terrified tears of her escape, nor the pained, exhausted sobs from their flight across the desert. These were different. They were quiet, cleansing tears of release. The truth was out, and the man beside her had not flinched. He had not turned away. Silas put down the fork he was holding. He looked at the tears tracking through the grime on her face. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for her. He simply took the greasy frying pan from the rinse basin, the last and hardest thing to clean. He poured fresh, hot water over it and began to scrub, his powerful hands working away the grime with a steady, relentless pressure. He was taking on the dirtiest job, standing beside her, his silent presence a vow more powerful than any words of comfort could ever be. Her quiet sobs shook her small frame. She leaned against the edge of the sink, her strength finally giving out. He kept scrubbing. He was a rock in the middle of her storm, unmoving, unyielding. His presence a silent declaration that she was not alone in this fight. When her tears began to subside, he rinsed the pan and set it aside. He looked at her tear-streaked face and her trembling hands. He reached over, not to touch her, but to pick up the clean, dry flour sack he had been using. He held it out. His eyes, in the flickering firelight, were not filled with pity. They were filled with a deep, quiet understanding. Ellie took the cloth from his hand. It was coarse and warm. She pressed it to her face, the simple, clean scent of it filling her senses. She was still in danger. She was still a fugitive. But as she stood there in the quiet cabin, beside this silent, steadfast man, she knew with a certainty that reached into her very soul that she was no longer alone, and for the first time she felt the profound, earth-shattering relief of a burden shared. The false dawn was painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and delicate rose when the peace was shattered. It wasn't a loud noise that broke the morning's fragile stillness. It was a subtle wrongness, a discordant note in the ranch's familiar symphony. The two horses in the corral, usually placid at this hour, suddenly grew agitated. They snorted, their heads coming up sharply, their ears swiveling toward the low ridge that marked the entrance to the valley. Inside the cabin, Silas was already awake. He was standing by the hearth, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the fire's embers slowly come back to life. He heard the horses. He went still, every sense honed by a lifetime of listening to the subtle language of the wild. He set his cup down without a sound and moved to the cabin's single window, peering through a small gap in the hide covering. For a long moment, he saw nothing but the familiar silhouettes of juniper and rock. Then, a flicker of movement. 3 riders, dark shapes against the growing light, moving not with the easy gait of friendly visitors, but with the grim, predatory purpose of hunters closing in on their prey. A cold, hard knot formed in his gut. He had known, on some level, that this peace was a temporary reprieve, a borrowed time. He had just hoped for more of it. He turned from the window. Ellie was still asleep in the lower bunk, her face soft in the dim light. One hand curled near her cheek. In the bunk above, Tom was a small, still shape, lost in the deep, untroubled sleep of childhood. They were the picture of innocent tranquility, and the sight of them fueled a cold, protective rage in Silas's chest. This was his home. They were under his roof. He moved to Ellie's side and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Her eyes flew open instantly, wide and filled with the reflexive fear of the hunted. Before she could make a sound, he put a finger to his lips, his gaze hard and urgent. "They're here," he whispered, the words like chips of ice. All the color drained from her face. The peaceful, sleeping girl was gone, replaced in an instant by the terrified fugitive from the train. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Get Tom!" Silas commanded in a low, steady voice that cut through her rising panic. "Take him to the back corner. Stay down and do not make a sound. Understand?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words, as she scrambled up to the top bunk to wake the boy. Silas moved to the door. He didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. He simply stood beside the heavy wooden plank, his body a silent, immovable obstacle. He reached over and, with a quiet scrape, slid the heavy iron bar from its brackets, leaving the door secured only by the simple wooden latch. It was a calculated risk, A barred door invited an immediate assault. An unbarred door might buy them a few precious seconds of dialogue. Ellie gently shook Tom awake. "Tom, honey, we have to play a game," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "A hiding game." The boy rubbed his eyes, his face clouded with sleep and confusion. But he sensed the raw fear radiating from her and did as he was told without protest. She helped him down from the bunk and hurried him to the far corner of the cabin, behind the woodpile, a space partially shielded from the door by the stone mass of the fireplace. "Stay here with me," she breathed, pulling him close and wrapping her arms around his small, warm body. "And be very, very quiet." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. There was a moment of absolute, ringing silence. Tom buried his face in Ellie's dress, his small body trembling. Ellie held her breath, her eyes locked on Silas's broad, unmoving back. Then came the voice, slick with false bonhomie and laced with menace. "Silas Boone, I know you're in there. I've come for my property." It was Jebediah Kane. Silas said nothing. The silence from the cabin was a more potent answer than any shouted defiance. "Don't be a fool. Boone." Kane's voice grew sharper, the pretense of civility dropping away. "I know she's with you. Send her out, along with the little bag she stole, and we'll be on our way. No one has to get hurt." Still, Silas remained silent, a statue of defiance. There was a muffled curse from outside. Then the sharp, splintering crack of a boot hitting wood. The door flew inward with a violent crash, slamming against the cabin wall. The three of them stood there, framed in the doorway against the pale morning light. Jebediah Kane, his face florid with anger, his fancy vest looking absurdly out of place. Flanking him were his two thugs, the gaunt, long-faced man Ellie now knew as Lank, and the brutish, thick-necked one, Cobb. Their hands were on their pistols, their eyes hard and merciless as they swept the cabin's interior. Kane's piggish eyes found Silas first. "You are making a grave mistake, Cowboy," he spat. Then his gaze slid past Silas and locked onto the corner behind the fireplace. He saw a flash of calico, a child's dark hair. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, a regular little family. How touching. Cobb, Lank, persuade Mr. Boone to be more hospitable. The two men moved into the cabin, spreading out to flank Silas. The space, which had once felt like a sanctuary, was suddenly claustrophobically small, charged with the electric threat of violence. "Last chance. Boone," Kane said, taking a step inside. "The girl, the ledger, now!" Silas finally moved. He didn't draw his weapon. He launched himself forward, not at the two thugs, but at Kane. It was a desperate, intelligent gamble. Take out the head of the snake, and the body might fall. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was shocking in a man his size, his fists driving forward like pistons. But Cobb was faster. The bulldog-like man intercepted him, catching him in a brutal bear hug. Cobb was immensely strong, his arms thick as tree limbs, and he squeezed, trying to crush the air from Silas's lungs. At the same time, Lank darted in from the side, a long, wicked-looking knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. The cabin erupted into a maelstrom of violence. It was not the clean, stylized fight of saloon brawls. It was a desperate, grunting, ugly struggle for survival. Silas, trapped in Cobb's grip, drove his head back with a savage force, connecting with Cobb's nose with a sickening crunch. The big man roared in pain, and his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Silas needed. He twisted, driving his elbow hard into Cobb's ribs, then brought a fist crashing down on the man's temple. Cobb staggered back, his eyes glazed, and collapsed onto the floor like a felled ox. One down. But Lank was on him instantly, the knife flashing. Silas caught the man's wrist, his fingers clamping down like a vice. The two men strained, their muscles corded, locked in a deadly, silent dance. Their struggle sent them crashing into the central table, which overturned with a loud crack, sending plates and cups skittering across the floor. From her corner, Ellie watched in horror, her arms a vice around Tom, who had begun to cry softly. She felt utterly helpless, a spectator at the destruction of her newfound peace. Jebediah Cain had retreated to the doorway, watching the fight with a cold, detached expression, content to let his hired muscle do the dirty work. Silas was a force of nature. He was stronger than Lank, and with a final, desperate heave, he twisted the man's arm, forcing him to drop the knife. He shoved Lank away and lunged for his own pistol, which was still holstered at his hip, but he never made it. As he reached for his weapon, Lank, recovering with surprising speed, grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from the pile near the hearth. He swung it like a club, a vicious, two-handed blow that caught Silas squarely on the side of the head. The sound was a dull, wet thud that made Ellie's stomach lurch. Silas's eyes went wide for a second in shock, a look of profound surprise on his face. Then his legs buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, face down, and did not move. A terrible, ringing silence fell over the cabin, broken only by Tom's frightened whimpers. "Silas!" The name was torn from Ellie's throat, a raw scream of anguish and despair. Cain stepped fully into the room, a triumphant sneer on his face. He nudged Silas's still form with the toe of his boot. "Fool," he muttered, then turned his attention to Ellie. "Now, little bird, I believe you have something that belongs to me." Lank started toward her, a cruel grin on his long face, but something had shifted in Ellie. The sight of Silas lying broken on the floor, the protector now in need of protecting, had extinguished the last of her passive fear and ignited a white-hot, desperate fury. She was no longer just a victim. She was a guardian. She pushed Tom behind her. "Stay back!" she shrieked, her eyes blazing. Lank just laughed and kept coming. Ellie's gaze darted around the small space, searching for a weapon. Anything. Her eyes fell on the heavy, cast-iron skillet sitting on the cold stovetop. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged for it, her hands closing around the handle. It was heavier than she expected, but her rage gave her strength. She swung it with all her might, a wild, desperate arc that caught the advancing Lank squarely on the shoulder. He howled in pain and surprise, stumbling back, his arm dropping uselessly to his side. The unexpected resistance had momentarily stunned him. It was in that moment that Ellie saw it. Lying on the floor, half hidden beneath the overturned table, was Silas's Colt Peacemaker. It must have been jolted from its holster during the fight. Without a second thought, she scrambled for it, her fingers closing around the cold steel and worn wood of the grip. It was heavy, alien, a thing of terrifying power. She had never fired a gun in her life. She fumbled with it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it straight. She managed to pull back the hammer, the metallic click echoing loudly in the silent cabin. She pointed it toward the door, toward Cain. "Get out!" she breathed, the words barely audible. "Get out of here and leave us alone!" Cain looked at her, at the shaking gun, at her terrified but resolute face. He saw not a threat, but an opportunity. His eyes darted to the side, to the small, crying boy cowering behind her. He moved with a speed that belied his bulk. Before Ellie could even process his intent, he lunged forward, not at her, but at Tom. He scooped the boy up in one arm, clamping a fleshy hand over his mouth to stifle his scream. He dragged the struggling child in front of him, using his small body as a shield. "Drop the gun, girl," Cain hissed, his face inches from Tom's. "Drop it now, or I swear I will snap this little whelp's neck right here." The world stopped. The gun in Ellie's hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. All the fight, all the rage, drained out of her, replaced by a cold, soul-crushing terror that was worse than anything she had ever felt before. Silas was unconscious, bleeding on the floor, and Tom, the small, solemn boy who had become the center of their quiet world, was a hostage, his life hanging by the most fragile of threads. The sanctuary had been breached. The wolf was inside the fold. Time ceased to be a river and became a single, frozen moment. The entire world constricted to the horrifying tableau in the center of the cabin. There was the sneering, triumphant face of Jebediah Cain, his features twisted with a cruel satisfaction. There was Tom, his small body rigid with terror, his eyes wide and pleading, a choked sob trapped behind the fleshy hand clamped over his mouth. And there was the gun in her own hand, a monstrously heavy piece of iron that was both her only hope and the instrument of Tom's potential doom. Ellie's arms trembled, the barrel of the Colt wavering. The shaking was not just in her hands. It was a violent ague that seized her entire body, a physical manifestation of the impossible war raging within her. Every instinct screamed at her to drop the gun, to give the man what he wanted, to do anything to erase the terror from Tom's eyes. He was a child. He was innocent. His life was worth more than any ledger, more than her own freedom. But another voice, colder and harder, born of the desperation that had driven her from her home and thrown her from a moving train, whispered a venomous truth. To surrender was not to save him. It was only to delay the inevitable. Men like Cain did not honor bargains. They devoured the weak. If she dropped the gun, he would take the ledger. He would take her, and he would leave Silas for dead. And what would he do with Tom, a witness to his crimes? The cold dread that answered that question was more terrifying than the gun itself. "I said, drop it," Cain hissed, giving Tom a cruel shake. The boy let out a muffled whimper of pain. The sound sliced through Ellie's paralysis. The warring voices in her head fell silent, replaced by a singular, clarifying thought that burned with the intensity of a branding iron. Protect the boy. Her trembling did not stop, but its nature changed. It was no longer the tremor of fear and indecision. It was the vibration of a bowstring pulled taut, of a system overloaded with adrenaline and a fierce, primal rage. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the gun. Her gaze, which had been wide with horror, narrowed into a point of lethal focus, fixed solely on Cain. "Let him go," she said. The words came out low and ragged, scraped raw from the depths of her soul. They were not a plea. They were a command. Cain laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You're in no position to be making demands. Girl, you're a frightened rabbit holding a stick it doesn't know how to use. Now, for the last time." He never finished the sentence. From outside the cabin, a deafening roar erupted. A sound so loud and concussive it seemed to shake the very logs of the walls. A section of the door frame just above Cain's head exploded inward in a shower of splinters and dust. The blast of a shotgun, fired at close range. The sudden, overwhelming violence of it was completely disorienting. Cain cried out in shock and pain as a splinter gashed his cheek, instinctively flinching and turning toward the new, unseen threat in the doorway. Lank, who had been nursing his injured shoulder, scrambled backward in alarm. In that single chaotic moment of distraction, Cain's grip on Tom loosened. His body was turned, his attention diverted. It was a split-second opening, a crack in the wall of impossibility. And Ellie's body acted without conscious thought. Her mind was a maelstrom of terror and instinct, but her hands, which had trembled with indecision, were suddenly steady. She didn't aim in the traditional sense. She simply pointed the heavy barrel at the man who held the child. Her entire being focused on a single, desperate purpose. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand with a force that was like a physical blow, a brutal, shocking violence that slammed her back a step and sent a jolt of pain all the way up to her shoulder. The explosion was deafening inside the small cabin, a sharp crack that was somehow more piercing than the shotgun's roar. Acrid, gray smoke billowed from the barrel, filling the air with its sharp, sulphurous smell. She had no idea where the bullet went. She had simply fired into the chaos. But Cain screamed. It was not a shout of anger this time, but a high, thin shriek of pure agony. He staggered back, releasing Tom as he clutched at his right arm, just above the elbow. A dark, ugly stain was already blossoming on the fabric of his sleeve. He had been hit. The shot had been a wild one, but it had found a mark. Tom was free. He stumbled away from Cain, his small face a mask of shock, and scrambled across the floor toward the only safety he knew. Ellie? At the same time, the cabin door was kicked open again, and an old man stood there, silhouetted against the morning sun. He was wiry and weathered, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, a sparse white beard clinging to his chin. He held a long-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles still smoking. This was Raoul, the old farmhand who came twice a week to help Silas with the heavier chores, a man whose quiet presence Ellie had only ever noted from a distance. Now, he looked as dangerous and immovable as the ancient, rocky hills. "Drop your weapon, Cain!" Raoul's voice was raspy, but carried the iron authority of a man who had seen his share of trouble. "Or the next one goes in your gut." The situation had completely and irrevocably shifted. Cain was wounded. His men were both down, Cobb still unconscious, Lank cowering with a broken shoulder, and they were now facing not one, but two guns. The fight was over. Panic replaced arrogance in Cain's eyes. "Lank, let's go!" he shrieked. Clutching his bleeding arm, he stumbled backward out of the doorway, his gaze flickering between Ellie's smoking pistol and Raoul's steady shotgun. Lank, needing no further encouragement, scrambled after him, his face pale with pain and fear. They half fell, half ran to their horses, mounted with clumsy haste, and spurred them into a frantic gallop, disappearing over the ridge as quickly as they had appeared. They didn't even spare a glance for the large, unmoving form of Cobb still lying on the cabin floor. The thundering of their hoofbeats faded, and an unnatural silence descended upon the cabin. It was a silence deeper and more profound than any they had known before, a vacuum left in the wake of incredible violence. It was filled with the smell of gunpowder and splintered wood, and the sight of the wreckage of their home. For a moment, everyone was frozen. Raoul stood in the doorway, his shotgun still at the ready. Tom was clinging to Ellie's leg, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Ellie stood in the center of the room, the heavy Colt still held in her hand, the barrel pointed at the floor. The ringing in her ears was so loud it was all she could hear. Then, the adrenaline that had held her together, that had given her the strength to fight, drained away all at once. It left a hollow, cavernous emptiness in its place, and a weakness so profound her knees buckled. The gun fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering loudly on the wooden floor. "Tom?" she whispered, her voice a choked, broken thing. She sank to her knees and pulled the boy into her arms, burying her face in his hair. She held him tightly, her entire body shaking, rocking him back and forth, murmuring his name over and over like a prayer. He was safe. He was alive. But then her gaze lifted from the boy and fell upon the still, unmoving form on the floor. Silas. The world, which had come back into focus for a brief, blessed moment, shattered once more. The sight of him lying there, so unnaturally still, a dark pool of blood matting the hair by his temple, was more horrifying than the gunfight, more terrifying than Cain's threats. He was the rock, the mountain, the silent, unshakable center of her new world, and he was broken. "No," she breathed. The word was a puff of air, a denial against the terrible reality before her. She gently pushed Tom toward Raoul, who stood watching them with sad, knowing eyes. "Take him," she whispered. She crawled the few feet across the floor to where Silas lay. The floorboards were rough and splintered beneath her palms. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. He was warm, but there was no response, no flicker of life. "Silas," she whispered, her voice tight with a rising tide of panic. "Silas, wake up!" She gently rolled him onto his back. His face was pale beneath the dust and grime. His eyes were closed. The gash on the side of his head was deep and ugly, the blood a dark, terrifying crimson against his skin. "Silas, please," she begged, her voice cracking. She put her head on his chest, desperate to hear the steady, reassuring beat of his heart she had felt on the train. It was there, but it was faint, a slow, thready rhythm that felt fragile and terrifyingly mortal. The last of her control broke. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart, the ones that had been shaken by his kindness and finally breached by his sacrifice, crumbled into dust. A sound tore from her throat, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. It was a raw, primal scream of anguish, of terror, of a loss so profound she could not yet comprehend it. She gathered his head into her lap, cradling him, her tears falling freely onto his still face, mingling with the blood and the dust. "No, no, no!" she wailed, rocking him as she had rocked Tom just moments before. "Silas, you can't leave. You promised with the iron bar. You promised wake up, please. Wake up, come back." Her voice broke into ragged, incoherent sobs. She clutched at the front of his shirt, her small frame convulsed with a grief so powerful it threatened to tear her apart. The girl who had once asked only to hide from the world was now screaming at its very foundations, trying to call back the silent guardian who had given her a place to stand. Time unraveled. The sharp, terrifying edges of the attack blurred into a long, gray twilight of waiting. In the immediate aftermath, it was Raoul's steady, quiet presence that kept the world from completely falling apart, with a strength that belied his age. He helped Ellie move Silas from the floor to the lower bunk, the same bunk she had occupied. It became his sickbed, an altar of stillness in the center of their shattered world. Raoul dealt with the grim necessities. He bound the unconscious Cobb with rope, propped him in a corner like a sack of grain, and dispatched his own grandson on horseback to fetch the nearest law, a day's ride away. He took a hammer and methodically began patching the splintered door frame. The rhythmic, percussive sound, a stubborn assertion of order against the recent chaos. Ellie's world, however, shrank to the narrow space beside the bunk. The cabin, the ranch, the vast desert outside, it all ceased to exist. Her universe was now defined by the length and breadth of the man who lay motionless before her. The fierce, desperate girl who had fired a gun was gone, replaced by a guardian of a different sort, a quiet, tireless sentinel. She became a student of his stillness. She learned the faint, shallow rhythm of his breathing, the almost imperceptible flutter of his eyelids as dreams, or perhaps nightmares, flickered through his unconscious mind. She bathed the ugly wound on his head with cool, clean water, her touch infinitely gentle, as if she could soothe away the violence that had been done to him. The blood was a stubborn stain in his dark hair, a constant, visceral reminder of how close she had come to losing him. Her days became a ritual of care, a silent liturgy of devotion. Raoul would cook, simmering pots of thin broth or watery corn gruel, the only nourishment Silas could possibly take, and Ellie would feed him. She would sit for an hour at a time, a small bowl in her lap, lifting the spoon to his lips, tipping it gently, and watching with a fierce, desperate hope as a trickle of liquid disappeared. More often than not, it would simply dribble down his chin, and she would wipe it away with a soft cloth, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Each swallowed drop was a victory, a tiny battle won in the great, silent war for his life. When the fever came, a dry, consuming heat that radiated from his skin, her vigil intensified. She was a constant presence, dipping a cloth in a basin of cool well water, wringing it out, and laying it across his forehead. She would leave it there until it grew warm from his inner fire, and then she would repeat the process, over and over, through the long, sweltering afternoons and into the deep, chilling nights. She was the guardian of the cool water, her simple, repetitive action a prayer against the heat that threatened to consume him from within. Tom, in the wake of the terror, retreated into a world of his own. He was quieter than ever, his large, solemn eyes holding a shadow of what he had witnessed. He spent his hours on the floor in a corner of the cabin, a piece of charcoal in his hand and a stack of rough, scrap pieces of wood as his canvas. At first, his drawings were chaotic and frightening jagged figures with guns, a house with a broken door, a large man lying on the floor. But as the days passed, a new subject began to dominate his art. He drew Silas in his bed, a still, straight line under a blanket. He drew Ellie sitting in the chair beside him, her head bowed. He drew Raoul by the fire, stirring a pot, unconsciously. The boy was sketching the shape of their new, broken family, a triad of silent figures bound together by crisis. Raoul became the quiet, gruff caretaker of them all. He made sure Ellie ate, placing a plate of food beside her and not leaving until she had taken a few bites. He kept the fire going, the woodpile stocked, the horses fed. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant, reassuring anchor. One evening, as Ellie sat staring at Silas's still form, her own face pale and drawn with exhaustion, Raoul placed a gentle, gnarled hand on her shoulder. "He's a fighter, that one," the old man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "He's fought worse than this. You just gotta give him a reason to come back." Ellie looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I don't know if he can hear me." "He hears you," Raoul said with a certainty that brooked no argument. "He ain't hearing the words. He's feeling the being here. That's what matters." And so she stayed. She talked to Silas in a low, constant murmur, her voice a soft thread weaving through the heavy silence of the room. She told him about her day, about the way Tom had drawn a picture of a smiling sun, about the hawk she had seen circling over the valley. She told him stories from her own childhood, of her mother teaching her to bake, of the feel of cool creek water on a hot summer day. She filled the space around him with her voice, with her life, hoping that some small part of it might penetrate the darkness where he was lost and serve as a beacon to guide him home. She read to him from the small, battered Bible she found on a shelf, her voice stumbling over the Psalms of comfort, the words a balm to her own raw soul as much as a plea for his. One afternoon, a full week after the attack, she was changing the bandage on his head. She had become practiced at the task, her movements sure and gentle. As she finished tying the knot, her fingers brushed against his unshaven cheek, and his eyelids flickered. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. Had she imagined it, his face remained a placid, unconscious mask. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over her. She sighed and turned to dip the cloth in the water basin. Then, a sound. It was not a word, just a low, rough sound from deep in his throat, the noise of a machine groaning back to life after a long disuse. She whipped back around. His brow was furrowed, a faint line of confusion between his eyes. His eyelids were no longer still. They were trembling, fighting against a great, unseen weight. She dropped the cloth and scrambled closer, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him, afraid to break the fragile spell. "Silas," she whispered, the name a fragile, hopeful thing. "Silas, can you hear me?" Slowly, agonizingly, his eyelids began to lift. It was the most beautiful, most miraculous thing she had ever witnessed. They were not the clear, pale blue eyes she remembered. They were clouded, unfocused, struggling to make sense of the light and the shapes before them. They drifted around the room, taking in the log ceiling, the stone fireplace, the small window. Then, they stopped. They found her face. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was not just a body in a bed. He was there. He was looking at her. The clouds in his eyes began to clear, replaced by a flicker of recognition, of dawning awareness. His gaze held hers, a silent, searching question. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her, a sound that was half laugh, half cry. You're back, she breathed, tears streaming down her face, no longer of grief, but of overwhelming joy. Oh, Silas, you're back. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping cough emerged. His lips were cracked and his throat was raw. She was at his side in an instant, lifting a cup of water, supporting his head with her free hand as she helped him take a small, difficult sip. He sank back against the pillow, the small effort having exhausted him. But his eyes never left her face. They were filled with a profound, unspoken gratitude. And something else, something deeper and more vulnerable than she had ever seen in them before. His left hand, the one that wasn't bandaged from a deep gash he'd sustained in the fight, moved on the blanket. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a testament to the immense effort it required. His fingers twitched, reaching. He was reaching for her. Without a thought, she placed her hand in his. His fingers, calloused and rough even in their weakness, closed around hers. His grip was not strong, but it was definite. It was the first time they had ever touched with such clear, gentle intention. It was not the desperate grip of a rescue, nor the impersonal brush of shared chores. It was a connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the fires of violence and the long, quiet hours of her vigil. The feel of his hand holding hers was an anchor, a confirmation that this was real, that he had truly returned from the brink. The simple, profound contact said everything that their silent gestures had only ever hinted at. She knelt by the side of his bed, her hand held firmly in his, her tears still falling freely. She looked at his tired, battered face, at the man who had faced down her demons and had nearly paid the ultimate price. She thought of the fear she had lived with her entire life, the fear of her father's weakness, of Cain's cruelty, of a world that saw her as a commodity. And she realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that fear was gone. It had been replaced by a different, sharper fear, the fear of losing him. But the old fear, the one that had defined her existence, had vanished. She leaned in close, her voice a raw, trembling whisper meant only for him. I haven't been scared anymore, she confessed, the truth of it a revelation even to herself. Not really. Not since the moment I met you. Summer returned to the high desert, not with a sudden announcement, but with a slow, gentle unfolding. It came in the warmth of the sun on the cabin's log walls, in the deeper green of the leaves on the ancient cottonwood, and in the chorus of cicadas that sang the afternoons to a sleepy, buzzing stillness. It was a season of healing, a time when the violent wounds of the past were slowly, patiently mended by the quiet, steady hands of the present. Silas's recovery was a mirror of the season's deliberate pace. The first days after he woke were a landscape of frustration and humbling weakness. He was a man accustomed to immense physical strength, and to find himself struggling to simply sit upright was a profound torment. But in this vulnerability, a new kind of intimacy was forged. Ellie was no longer just his nurse. She became his strength. When he took his first steps from the bunk to the door, it was her shoulder he leaned on, his large hand gripping her with a tremor of effort that spoke more than words ever could. She did not coddle him, but she was a constant, steady presence, her quiet encouragement a balm to his bruised pride. The day the marshal finally came, guided by Raoul's grandson, was a quiet turning point. The lawman, a grim, weary veteran, took their statements, his eyes lingering on Silas's bandaged head and the repaired doorframe. He carted away the sullen, still-bound form of Cobb, and promised he would put out the word on Cain and Lank. But men like that, he'd said, his voice heavy with experience, they tend to run far when a deal goes sour. You're likely safe here for a good while. They won't be back soon. With his departure, the last echo of the attack seemed to fade, leaving behind a profound and welcome peace. The immediate, external threat was gone, allowing the much slower, more difficult work of internal healing to truly begin. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, a shared cadence that was as natural and unspoken as breathing. They were no longer two separate entities, the silent man and the grateful girl, but a single, functioning unit. Their days were a tapestry woven from the threads of shared labor, each action a silent declaration of their mutual dependence and growing affection. The corral gate, damaged in the flight of the horses during the attack, became their first joint project. The work was slow, dictated by Silas's returning strength. Ellie would hold the heavy cedar posts steady in the holes they had dug, her arms straining, while Silas, his movements still careful, would swing the heavy mallet. The thud of the wood against wood was a solid, reassuring sound. When it came time to affix the hinges, they worked in close proximity, a silent, coordinated dance. He would hold a nail in place, his large, scarred fingers next to her smaller, paler ones, and she would hand him the hammer. Their hands would brush, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of warmth through her, a quiet acknowledgement of their closeness. They were not just mending a gate, they were rebuilding the walls of their sanctuary. Together, the garden, once solely Ellie's domain, became a shared space in the long, golden afternoons. Silas would now carry the heavy buckets of water from the well, his gait growing steadier and stronger each day. He would leave them at the edge of the neat rows, and she would ladle the water onto the thirsty plants. He would often stay, leaning against the fence, his gaze soft as he watched her work, her hands gentle as she tended the green, hopeful shoots of corn and squash. He was investing his time, his returning strength, into her small patch of life, a silent promise of a shared harvest. It was in these quiet, sun-drenched moments that Tom, the small, solemn bridge between them, began to truly heal as well. The darkness in his eyes began to recede, replaced by the natural, easy curiosity of a child. One afternoon, as the three of them sat in the shade of the cottonwood, Silas plucked a broad, green blade of grass. He held it taut between his thumbs and, bringing it to his lips, blew a sharp, reedy note into the quiet air. Tom's eyes went wide with wonder. "How?" he asked, the single word a demand for magic. A rare, faint smile touched the corners of Silas's mouth. "You gotta hold it just so," he said, his voice still a little rough. He showed the boy, his large, powerful hands surprisingly gentle as he positioned the blade between Tom's small thumbs. Ellie leaned in close to watch, her hair brushing against Silas's shoulder. The three of them were a small, self-contained world, their heads bowed together in shared, intense concentration. Tom blew, and only a soft puff of air emerged. He tried again, his cheeks puffed out, his face a mask of determination. Finally, on the fourth try, a high, wavering, wonderfully loud squawk erupted from the blade of grass. Tom's face broke into a grin of pure, unadulterated triumph. He looked from Silas to Ellie and back again, his joy a palpable thing that enveloped them all. In that moment, watching the shared, gentle smile that passed between the quiet man and the boy, Ellie felt a sense of rightness so profound it ached. This was the sound of a family. Their unspoken language continued to evolve, growing richer and more nuanced with each passing day. The gestures became smaller, more personal, whispers of the heart that required no sound. One morning, Ellie found a tiny, brilliant blue wildflower on her wanderings, a scrap of fallen sky hiding in the shade of a rock. She picked it, and that evening, she didn't place it in a cup or on a table. She laid it on the threshold of the cabin door, a simple, humble offering to the home they were building, a silent thank you left at the gates of her sanctuary. Later that night, as the firelight danced and Tom slept soundly, she saw Silas retrieve the flower. He sat at the table, and from an inner pocket of the canvas duster he so rarely took off, he produced a small, worn leather notebook, bound by a leather thong. It was a deeply personal object. She had never seen it before. He handled it with a reverence that bespoke its importance. He untied the thong and opened the book, She saw pages filled with his cramped, blocky script lists of supplies, notes about weather patterns, perhaps a name or two from a life she knew nothing about. With a tenderness that seemed almost out of place in his large, scarred hands, he took the tiny blue flower. He carefully opened the book to a clean page in the middle, laid the flower flat, and gently closed the cover, pressing the small piece of beauty and hope into the pages of his own private history. He was writing her into his story, preserving her quiet offering within the ledger of his life, watching him, unseen, from her bunk. Ellie felt her heart swell with an emotion so deep and powerful it left her breathless. It was a love that needed no grand declarations, no flowery words. It was a love as quiet, as resilient, and as real as a wildflower blooming in the desert. The summer deepened. The scar on Silas's head faded from a raw wound to a pale, silver line, hidden now by his dark hair. The last of the bruises on Ellie's own skin, reminders of her desperate tumble from the train, had long since vanished. The physical evidence of their shared trauma was disappearing, smoothed over by the healing balm of time and peace. But as the external wounds faded, the internal changes deepened. The wild, hunted look in Ellie's eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, steady light. The profound, haunted loneliness that had once radiated from Silas like a cold aura had been supplanted by a quiet, watchful contentment. They moved around each other with an easy, fluid grace, their individual orbits having merged into a single, stable system. They were two halves of a whole, their jagged, broken edges fitting together in a way that made them both stronger. One evening, they sat on the porch, the day's work done. Silas leaned against a post, his long legs stretched out, while Ellie sat on the top step, mending one of Tom's perpetually torn shirts. Tom was in the yard, chasing fireflies as they began to blink in the deepening twilight. The sky was a vast, velvet canvas, and the first stars were beginning to appear. No words passed between them. None were needed. The comfortable silence was its own conversation, filled with the shared memories of hardship overcome and the quiet promise of peaceful days to come. The summer had returned, and it had brought with it not just warmth and light, but the slow, miraculous blooming of a home and a love that had taken root in the most unlikely of soils. The sun was a painter in its final, glorious moments, washing the vast canvas of the New Mexico sky with strokes of molten gold, deep violet, and the soft, blushing pink of a wild rose. The heat of the day had finally broken, surrendering to a gentle evening breeze that whispered through the pinon pines and carried the clean, spicy scent of sagebrush. It was an hour of profound peace, a time when the harsh, unforgiving lines of the desert softened into a landscape of breathtaking, transient beauty. On the porch of the small log cabin, this peace was a tangible thing. It settled over the three figures like a warm, familiar blanket. Silas sat on the top step, his back resting against a porch post. His long frame relaxed in a way it had never been before. The deep lines of pain and exhaustion that had been etched into his face were gone, smoothed away by time and contentment, leaving behind the quiet strength that was the bedrock of his nature. He was methodically sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic, scraping sound a soft, domestic counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. Ellie sat near him, her knees drawn up, her chin resting on them. Her mending basket lay forgotten at her side. She wasn't watching her hands, or the yard, or the sky. She was watching him. She was studying the way the fading light caught the silver in his dark hair, the steady, competent movement of his hands, the calm, easy set of his shoulders. In his stillness, she saw a universe of strength and safety. She saw her home. In the dusty yard below, Tom was a whirlwind of joyous, 6-year-old energy. He was no longer the solemn, watchful child who had greeted them on that first, desperate night. He was a boy who knew laughter, who chased lizards for the sheer sport of it, and who now held a fistful of dandelions he had painstakingly collected. He ran to the porch, his face flushed and serious, and presented one to Ellie, and then, with a shy, gap-toothed grin, one to Silas. He then ran back to the center of the yard, lay on his back, and began to blow the feathery seeds into the twilight, his soft puffs of breath sending tiny, hopeful parachutes drifting into the purple air. They watched him, a shared, silent smile passing between them. He was their living, breathing proof of a future, a testament to the life they had nurtured from the ashes of violence and fear. Ellie's gaze returned to Silas. A lifetime seemed to have passed since that terrible day on the train. She remembered the girl she had been, a creature of pure, mindless terror, running from a fate she could not bear. She had seen Silas as a rock, a shield, a dark and anonymous place to hide. He had been a means to an end, her only hope for survival. But as the days had bled into weeks, and the weeks into months, the rock had revealed itself to be a mountain, with hidden springs of kindness and deep, quiet valleys of surprising gentleness. The shield had become a shelter, a place not just to hide from the world, but to live in it. The silence between them stretched, comfortable and full. It was a silence that no longer needed to be filled with gestures or unspoken words. It was a silence that simply was, a shared space of complete and utter understanding. But tonight, there was something Ellie needed to put into that silence, not to change it, but to honor it. She had carried the words in her heart for weeks, letting them ripen until they felt as real and as solid as the man sitting beside her. She took a soft, steadying breath. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than the whisper of the breeze, a sound meant only for him. "At first," she began, her gaze still fixed on his strong profile, "I just wanted to hide under your coat." He stopped sharpening the knife. The rhythmic scraping ceased, and the sudden quiet made the crickets sound impossibly loud. He did not turn to look at her, but she saw his hands go still on the whetstone, a sign that he was listening with his entire being. She continued, the words a simple, unadorned truth. "That was all I could think about, just finding a shadow to disappear into, but now—" She paused, and her voice dropped even lower, filled with a quiet, reverent wonder. "Now, I want to stand beside you for a lifetime." The declaration hung in the soft twilight air. It was not a question. It was not a proposal. It was a statement of fact, as elemental and true as the stars that were beginning to prick the darkening sky. It was the final, quiet confession of a heart that had found its harbor. For a long moment, Silas did not move. He remained facing forward, looking out at the boy and the fireflies and the vast, open land that was his life. Ellie's heart beat a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. She had not spoken to demand a response. She had spoken simply to tell him the truth. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His pale blue eyes, no longer haunted by ghosts but clear and deep as a mountain lake, met hers, and in their depths, she saw everything she needed to see. She saw the echo of her own feelings, a love as quiet, as profound, and as unshakable as his own silent nature. He saw her, the woman she had become, not the frightened girl she had been, and he loved her. He put the knife and the whetstone down on the porch beside him. He reached over and took her hand. It was not the firm, commanding grip of their escape, nor the weak, searching touch of his recovery. It was a hand that knew hers completely. His thumb stroked the back of her palm, a slow, deliberate caress that was more articulate than 1,000 sonnets. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply tightened his grip, a firm, gentle pressure that was a vow, a promise, and a prayer all in one. It was the silent, unbreakable contract of his soul. "I am here. I will always be here." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He gave a soft whistle, and Tom, seeing them standing, scrambled up and ran inside the cabin, knowing without being told that it was time for bed. Silas kept hold of her hand and led her down the steps and into the yard. He didn't walk toward the stable or the corral. He led her away from the small circle of their domestic life, toward the open land, toward the low, rolling hills that sloped down into the vastness of the desert. They walked in a comfortable silence, their steps falling into a familiar rhythm. They were heading toward the place where the neat, hard-won order of the ranch gave way to the wild, untamed beauty of the wilderness. It was the edge of the same brutal landscape they had once fled across, a place that had once been synonymous with terror and desperation. But now, in the gentle grace of the summer rains, it had been transformed. The ground beneath their feet softened, and they entered a sprawling meadow of wildflowers, their colors muted to shades of silver and deep purple in the moonlight. The air was thick with their sweet, heady perfume. This was the place where fear had ended and hope had begun. It was the landscape of their new beginning. They stopped in the center of the meadow, surrounded by the quiet, sleeping blossoms. The moon was rising, a perfect silver disk, casting their long shadows across the land. They stood side by side, their hands still linked, looking out not at each other, but at the far, endless horizon. They were two solitary figures who had found their completion in one another, their quiet love as vast and as peaceful as the star-dusted sky above them. The girl who had once begged to hide under a stranger's coat had now found a home in his heart. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and support us by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.